Hello, welcome to Dark Hearts. My name's Melody, I'm your forensic historian, and this is Missy. Together we're going to be exploring the darkest stories of Hertfordshire's past, the crimes, the trials, and looking at the psychology behind them to see if there's any connections between then and now. In our very first episode, we'll be going back to the early 18th century and the story of Jane Wenham, the last person to be convicted and condemned to death for witchcraft in England. Her story highlights fears, prejudices and social pressures that shape communities and turn them against individuals. We'll be looking at the psychology of scapegoating, mass hysteria and cognitive biases, and see if there's any similar patterns today where vulnerable groups face persecution. Along the way, we'll visit sites and I'll share some insights drawn from my background in history and forensic psychology, as well as my years of experience of working in the Hertfordshire and Bedfordshire courts. Okay, Jane's story is not just a story from the past, it's a lens to understand how fear, suspicion and injustice still shapes communities today. So settle in and join me and Missy as we begin our journey into the shadow of Hertfordshire's dark past. Okay. 1712 Hertfordshire, in the quiet lanes of Walkern, a woman's life hung in the balance, not for theft or murder, but for witchcraft. Her story shocked a county and even reached the attention of Queen Anne herself. But what could have led ordinary villagers to accuse one of their own of consorting with the devil? Walkern, near Stevenage, had a small tight-knit community where superstition ran deep. Even though there was growing scepticism about witchcraft throughout England, fears and beliefs in witches still existed, fueled by personal grudges, misfortune and the unknown.
In 1712, Jane was 70 years old. She was living alone in poverty. She apparently lived somewhere along Church Lane, on the outskirts of Walkern. She was heavily reliant on her community for the things that she could beg for or buy cheaply. One day, Jane approached a farmhand, Matthew Gilston, and asked if she could buy some hay for a penny. Matthew refused, but later reported that Jane had muttered something under her breath as she had left. After she left, Matthew suddenly felt overwhelmed and had no control over himself. He stripped off his shirt and ran straight into a river. He then went and gathered straw and hay from animal dung. He returned to the farm and told his master, the farmer John Chapman, what had happened. John was already suspicious of Jane. He suspected that she was responsible for the deaths of people in the village and of livestock. John and Matthew went to Jane's cottage and called her a witch and a bitch. Jane was a very resilient woman. She was aged 70 already when the life expectancy for women was 50 at the time. She lived in poverty and isolation, had survived plagues and other diseases, and she was born during the time that England was at the height of a brutal civil war. Jane was having none of it. She reported to the Justice of the Peace, Henry Chauncey, but he would not get involved. He instead referred her to the Reverend Gardner, the rector of Walkern, who tried to mediate and ordered John to pay 1 shilling to Jane. Jane knew how serious the accusation of being a witch was and decided this was not justice. She declared if she was not going to have justice here, she will get it another way. When she was leaving the rectory, Jane passed 16-year-old Anne Thorne. The Reverend and his wife and the vicar of Hitchin, Francis Bragg, who had been visiting, heard loud noises coming from the kitchen. They went in to find Anne dishevelled and in a complete state. She claimed that she had seen Jane and heard her mutter something, and it had caused her to become overwhelmed, much like Matthew had been, and she had run across fields and gathered up sticks and leaves, even though she had a bad knee, and in the time that it had taken to get to where she said she ran to, she would have had to have run at 8 miles an hour. The people in the kitchen saw the bundle of sticks and decided it was a witch's charm and it should be thrown into the fire, which they did, and as soon as they did, Jane returned at the door. Jane was there, saying that she was calling to ask Anne's mother about going washing the next day in Ardley. However innocent this may have been, to the people there it was very suspicious. The next day, Anne bumped into Jane again, and Jane told her off for calling her a witch. Anne was very upset and ran back to the rectory, and shortly after began to have fits. She even tried to drown herself. The Reverend Gardener decided that there was no other option than to have Jane summoned to court for being a witch in order to save Anne. The Justice of the Peace, Henry Chauncey, who previously had refused to help Jane, now issued an arrest warrant. When they arrived at Jane's cottage, she refused to open the door and it had to be kicked down. Anne Thorne was there and she attacked Jane, scratching her face, but she did not bleed, a sure sign of being a witch. Other tests were ordered. Jane was stripped and searched for witches' marks, but none could be found. Pins were used to prick at Jane in her arms and other parts of her body, but no blood was released. Finally, Jane was asked to recite the Lord's Prayer, but she got this wrong and said, "Lead me not into no temptation." This was indeed a sign she was a witch.
The trial took place in Hertford. Even though the evidence was extremely flimsy, it included things like Jane had begged for turnips from one farmer and a month later a couple of his sheep had died. Other evidence included Jane being responsible for a baby's death, her face being seen on a cat, someone accused her of flying, and someone else also said that they had found feathers in their pillow, and that must have been Jane. The judge, Sir John Powell, tried his hardest to convince the jury to acquit. He'd even said famously that flying was not a crime. However, the jury came back with the verdict of guilty. Under law of the Witchcraft Act 1604, the only sentence that Sir Powell could hand down was death. He immediately stayed the execution so it could be appealed. This was the age of enlightenment, of scientific revolution, where reason and evidence were more important than speculation and rumour. There seemed to be very little evidence in witch trials. The appeal went all the way to the Queen, to Queen Anne, who gave a royal pardon to Jane. So Jane, therefore, was the last person to be condemned and convicted as a witch. However, she managed to get away with her life. Jane was shown further mercies. Following her pardon, she couldn't go back to Walkern. The people there had wanted her dead. They probably still believed that she was a witch. She was taken in by Colonel Plummer of Gilston Park, just a mile north of Harlow, until his death in 1720. Following that, she went to live with the Cowpers in Hertfordshire, just south of Hertford, where she lived until her death in 1730, when she was probably around 87 or 88 years old. It's alleged that she's buried in an unmarked grave in St Mary's Church in Hertfordshire. Following Jane's pardon, things started to change in law. A Witchcraft Act of 1735 put an end to witch trials. It was no longer legal to try someone as a witch. However, it was illegal to claim to possess magical powers. The last person to be tried under that act was Helen Duncan in 1944. Helen was a spiritual medium who said that she could excrete ectoplasm during seances. She had also discussed a sinking naval battleship before it was public knowledge. She was considered to be a threat to public safety. She went to prison for 9 months. Following Helen Duncan's conviction, the law changed again, and in 1951 the UK government introduced the Fraudulent Mediums Act. This stayed in place until 2008, only 17 years ago, when the claims of having spiritual or magical powers fell under the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading regulations. We are essentially still, under law, protected from witches.
Accusations of witchcraft often tell us more about the accuser's fears than the accused actions. A big part of the growth and prevalence of the mass hysteria about witches that we know about today is thanks to the growth of cheap and easily accessible pamphlets, the precursor to what we know as tabloid newspapers, often fabricated or sensationalised in order to increase sales and drum up public interest. One fabricated trial and execution was Mary Hicks and her 9-year-old daughter in 1716 in Huntingdon. It was made up of almost word for word from old reports. Ordinary people in rural areas might not have been critical about what they read. There was some positives about the pamphlets. They were spreading some truth and helping to support debate, particularly in the time of scientific reasoning. They led to support changes in the law and ways of thinking amongst people. There was also negatives, much like we see in the media today, demonising and perpetuating fear and beliefs in witches, falsifying information and leading to real harm. One incident happened in 1745. A woman named Ruth Osborne and her husband, who lived in Tring in West Hertfordshire. They had been accused of being witches, and a mob of villagers had gathered to perform swimming of witches or ducking. Ruth had tried to keep herself afloat. However, the mob had pushed her under the water with a stick. She had drowned and died. Thomas Colley was held accountable. He was convicted and executed for her murder. Although times were changing, the same mechanisms still exist today. Those of fear, rumour and groupthink. And we see these in headlines influencing extreme behaviour towards socially vulnerable people. We try to understand Jane's accusers from a psychological perspective. We might want to look at the social developmental perspectives of what was happening for them. There's certain theories that might be relevant here. Social learning theory, social development theory, social norms, and social identity theory. Those theories encompass what individuals have learned about the world through their social relationships and their interactions with others. And these interactions and relationships shape how they think and behave within their social groups, but also how they think about themselves. Jane's accusers would have wanted to have been in the in-group and not the out group. They wouldn't have wanted to be accused of being a witch themselves. Those group dynamics of in and out groups also influence group think, which is a want to have social cohesion and to keep the peace and their place in the group. They wouldn't want to be accused themselves. They wouldn't want to be in the outside of the village community, particularly when they're so reliant on each other. So they may not have completely agreed with the accusations, but they may have fed into them and bought into them to maintain their place in the group. There's certain thought processes that have to happen with groupthink. And there's going to be confirmation biases, so they're going to look for evidence that supports what they and the group are thinking. They're going to see what they want to see. There's going to be cognitive distortions and dissonance, so they're going to ignore facts that are to the contrary, even if they're more valid. They might not notice these in different circumstances, but for those incidences where they need to make those accusations, they're going to find the evidence that they need. There's a shared anxiety and a moral panic that almost cost Jane her life, but at the same time the villagers were going to have been anxious for their own lives if they stepped out of the group. So the fears and the rumours spread through communities, and vulnerable individuals are targeted and blamed for social anxieties. This happens even today. We see it with refugees at the moment, and they're blamed for perhaps housing crisis, unemployment, no funds for benefits and benefit cuts, issues with social problems in communities, crime for instance. This fear is weaponised, but it reminds us that we must question rumours and stories and step outside of the group and learn to think for ourselves and be critical, because there is always the risk of history repeating itself. Jane Wenham's story is really a window into human psychology and justice and the evolution of law. It teaches us how fear can distort perception, but it also teaches us that courage and reason really can prevail. What would you have done if you lived in Walkern in 1712? Thank you for joining me and Missy today on our walk through Walkern. Please like, share and subscribe for more stories from Dark Hearts, where we'll be exploring Hertfordshire's darkest past.